Winifred Sutton stood at the edge of the church hall in Oro Grande, California, watching couples spin across the wooden floor as the fiddler struck up another lively tune. And she knew with certainty that this evening would unfold exactly like every other social gathering she had ever attended in her 22 years of life. The year was 1882, and the summer heat had finally broken enough that the townspeople felt justified in organizing a proper dance. Lanterns hung from the rafters, casting warm, golden light across the room, and the smell of pine and candle wax mingled with the perfume worn by the more fashionable ladies. Winifred had positioned herself near the refreshment table, a strategic location that allowed her to appear occupied while avoiding the humiliation of standing alone in the middle of the room. She smoothed down the blue calico dress she had sewn herself, knowing it was well made but lacking the ruffles and lace that adorned the gowns of the banker's daughters and the store owner's nieces. It was not that Winifred was unattractive. She had clear skin, dark brown hair that she had painstakingly pinned into a respectable style, and intelligent hazel eyes that observed far more than most people realized. But she was plain in a way that made her invisible. She was neither wealthy nor connected to any important family. Her father had been a hard-working farmer who died when she was 16, leaving her and her mother with just enough land to scrape by. Her mother had passed 2 years later from pneumonia, and Winifred had been living alone since then, managing the small farm and selling vegetables in town to earn her keep. She was known as a competent, reliable woman, but not one who turned heads or inspired romantic notions. The other young women in town had learned to look past her years ago. They formed their circles and shared their secrets without ever thinking to include her. The men never asked her to dance. At first, when she was younger, it had stung deeply. She would go home and cry into her pillow, wondering what was wrong with her. But as the years passed, she had developed a thick skin, or so she told herself. She attended these gatherings out of a sense of obligation to remain part of the community, but she expected nothing from them. Winifred poured herself a cup of lemonade and took a small sip, her eyes drifting over the crowd. Margaret Dover was laughing with a group of men near the door, her blonde curls bouncing as she moved. Sarah Ann Miller was dancing with the blacksmith's son, her face flushed with happiness. Even Mary Patterson, who was known for her sharp tongue and difficult personality, had found a dance partner. Winifred felt the familiar hollow feeling in her chest but pushed it away. She would stay for another hour to be polite, and then she would walk home to her empty farmhouse and feed the chickens and go to bed. The music ended, and the dancers applauded politely. The fiddler announced a brief intermission, and people began moving toward the refreshment table. Winifred stepped back, making room for others, and found herself pressed against the wall. She made herself as small as possible, trying not to be in anyone's way. A group of women her age clustered near her, but they talked among themselves as if she were not there. "Did you see that new cowboy who rode into town yesterday?" one of them said excitedly. "He was at the livery stable this afternoon." "Oh, I saw him," another replied. "Tall, dark hair and those eyes. I heard he is working at the Dixon Ranch." "Someone said he came up from Texas," a third woman added. "Apparently, he is one of the best horse breakers in the territory." Winifred listened without meaning to. She had not heard about any new arrival, but then again, she rarely heard the gossip firsthand. She learned things days after everyone else, in fragments overheard at the general store or in passing conversations. The fiddler called for the next dance, and the crowd began to reform. Winifred watched as the women around her were claimed by various partners and led onto the floor. She turned to set her empty cup back on the table when a voice behind her spoke. "Excuse me, miss. Would you care to dance? Winifred froze. For a moment, she thought the question must be directed at someone else, but when she turned around, she found herself looking up at a man she had never seen before. He was tall, as the women had said, with dark brown hair that curled slightly at his collar and deep blue eyes that looked at her with genuine warmth. He wore clean work clothes, a simple shirt and vest with trousers that had seen use but were well cared for. His boots were scuffed but polished. He held his hat in his hands and was looking directly at her, waiting for an answer. "Me?" Winifred asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Yes, you," he said, a gentle smile crossing his face. "I would be honored if you would dance with me." Winifred glanced around, half expecting someone to laugh or for this to be some kind of cruel joke, but the man's expression remained open and sincere. Her heart began to beat faster and she felt heat rise to her cheeks. Yes, I would like that," she managed to say. He extended his hand and she placed hers in it, feeling the calluses on his palm, the strength in his fingers. He led her onto the dance floor, and as the music began, he placed his other hand lightly on her waist. Winifred tried to remember the steps, suddenly self-conscious about every movement. "I am Quinton Xavier," he said as they began to move. "I just arrived in Oro Grande yesterday." "Winifred Sutton," she replied, concentrating on not stepping on his feet. "I heard some of the ladies mention you." "Nothing too scandalous, I hope," he said with a hint of humor in his voice. "Just that you are from Texas and that you work with horses." "That is all true. I am working at the Dixon Ranch for now, breaking horses and helping with the cattle. It is good work." Winifred relaxed slightly as she found the rhythm of the dance. Quinton was an excellent dancer and he guided her smoothly across the floor. She was aware of people watching them, could feel eyes on her back, but for once she did not care. The feeling of being noticed, of being chosen, was intoxicating. "Have you lived in Oro Grande long?" Quinton asked. "All my life," Winifred said. "I have a small farm just outside of town." "A farm? You run it yourself?" "Yes, it is not much, just vegetables and some chickens, but it keeps me fed." Something in Quinton's eyes shifted, a look of respect that Winifred was not accustomed to seeing. "That is impressive. It must be hard work." "It is, but I do not mind it. I like working with my hands, watching things grow." The dance continued, and they fell into an easy conversation. Quinton asked her about the town, about the people, about what life was like in this part of California. Winifred found herself answering more freely than she usually did, surprised by how easy it was to talk to him. He listened carefully to everything she said, as if her words actually mattered. When the music ended, Winifred expected him to thank her politely and move on to another partner, as was customary. Instead, he said, "Would you dance the next one with me as well?" Winifred blinked in surprise. "Are you certain? There are many other ladies here." "I am certain," Quinton said firmly. "I am enjoying your company very much." So they danced the next dance and then the one after that. By the fourth dance, Winifred was aware that people were whispering, that heads were turning in their direction, but Quinton seemed entirely unbothered. He kept his attention focused on her, asking questions, sharing stories about his travels, making her laugh with his descriptions of ornery horses and stubborn cattle. When the evening finally came to an end, Quinton walked Winifred to the door of the church hall. The night air was cool and fresh after the warmth inside, and stars blazed overhead in the clear desert sky. "May I walk you home?" Quinton asked. Winifred hesitated. It was a 20-minute walk to her farm, and she was not sure what people would say. But then she thought of how invisible she had been just hours ago, and how alive she felt now, and she nodded. They walked through the quiet streets of Oro Grande, past the darkened storefronts and the occasional lit window. Quinton offered her his arm, and she took it, feeling the solid strength of him beside her. They talked about everything and nothing, the conversation flowing naturally. When they reached her property, Winifred pointed out the small house, the vegetable garden visible in the moonlight, the chicken coop in the back. "It is a good piece of land," Quinton said appreciatively. "You have taken good care of it." "I try," Winifred said. She turned to face him, suddenly unsure of what to say. "Thank you for tonight, for asking me to dance." "Thank you for saying yes," Quinton replied. He looked at her for a long moment, and something in his gaze made Winifred's breath catch. "Miss Sutton, I wonder if I might call on you." "Properly, I mean, I would like to see you again." Winifred felt tears prick at her eyes, unexpected and sharp. She blinked them back quickly. "I would like that very much. Tomorrow evening, I could come by after I finish work at the ranch." "Yes, tomorrow evening." Quinton smiled, a warm, genuine expression that reached his eyes. He tipped his hat to her and said good night, then waited until she had gone inside before he turned and walked back toward town. Winifred closed the door behind her and leaned against it, her heart racing. She could hardly believe what had just happened. For the first time in her life, someone had seen her, really seen her, and he wanted to see her again. Sleep was impossible that night. Winifred lay in bed, replaying every moment of the evening, every word Quinton had said, every look he had given her. She told herself not to get her hopes up, that he might change his mind in the morning, that this might all disappear like a dream. But a small, stubborn part of her heart dared to hope. The next day passed with agonizing slowness. Winifred went through her usual chores, feeding the chickens, weeding the garden, picking vegetables to take to market. But her mind was elsewhere, and she found herself constantly glancing at the road, wondering if Quinton would truly come. As the sun began to set, she went inside and washed up, changed into a clean dress, and brushed out her hair before pinning it up again. She felt ridiculous for making such an effort, but she could not help herself. Just as the light was fading, she heard the sound of a horse approaching. She went to the window and saw Quinton riding up the path on a sturdy bay gelding. Her heart leapt. She opened the door before he could knock, and Quinton grinned when he saw her. "Good evening, Miss Sutton." "Good evening, Mr. Xavier. I thought we could take a walk if that would be agreeable to you. It is a beautiful evening." They walked around the property, and Winifred found herself showing him everything, pointing out which crops were growing best, explaining her plans for the next season. Quinton listened with genuine interest, asking thoughtful questions and offering suggestions based on his own experience. He had grown up on a ranch in Texas, he told her, and had learned about farming and livestock from an early age. As they walked, Winifred learned more about him. He was 26 years old, the youngest of 3 brothers. His family still lived in Texas, running a successful cattle operation. But Quinton had wanted to see more of the country, to make his own way rather than simply working for his father. He had been traveling for 2 years, taking jobs on various ranches, learning everything he could about the land and the animals and the business. "You plan to stay in Oro Grande?" Winifred asked, trying to keep her voice casual. "I had not decided," Quinton admitted, "but I am finding reasons to consider it." He looked at her as he said it, and Winifred felt warmth spread through her chest. Over the following weeks, Quinton came to visit every evening after he finished work at the Dixon Ranch. Sometimes they would walk. Sometimes they would sit on the porch and talk as the sun set. He helped her with heavy chores, fixing a broken fence post, repairing the chicken coop door, chopping wood for the winter. Winifred would cook supper for them, simple meals of beans and cornbread or stew with vegetables from her garden, and Quinton always ate with appreciation and complimented her cooking. The people in town noticed, of course. Winifred could feel the eyes on her when she went to market, could hear the whispers that stopped when she came near. Some of the women who had never spoken to her before suddenly tried to strike up conversations, clearly fishing for information about Quinton. Winifred kept her answers brief and polite, unwilling to share the details of her growing relationship with people who had never cared about her before. Margaret Dover stopped her one day outside the general store, her pretty face arranged in an expression of concern. "Winifred, I hope you do not mind me saying this, but people are talking about you and that cowboy." "Are they?" Winifred said mildly. "Yes, and I just wanted to warn you. Men like that who drift from place to place, they do not usually settle down. I would hate to see you get hurt." Winifred looked at Margaret, at the false sympathy in her eyes, and felt a surge of anger. Where had this concern been all the years she had been ignored? "I appreciate your worry, Margaret, but I am quite capable of managing my own affairs." She walked away before Margaret could respond, her head held high. That evening, when Quinton arrived, Winifred was quieter than usual. They sat on the porch, watching the last light fade from the sky, and finally Quinton said, "Something is bothering you. Will you tell me what it is?" Winifred hesitated, then decided to be honest. "People in town are talking about us. Someone suggested today that you are not the settling kind, that you will move on eventually." Quinton was quiet for a moment. Then he reached over and took her hand, his fingers warm and strong around hers. "Winifred, I need to tell you something. I have been thinking about my future, about what I want from life. For the past 2 years, I have been drifting, not because I wanted to, but because I had not found a reason to stay anywhere. But these past few weeks with you, I have felt something I have never felt before. I have felt like I am home." Winifred turned to look at him, her heart pounding. "I am in love with you," Quinton said simply. "I think I have been since that first night at the dance, when I saw you standing alone and wondered how everyone could be so blind. You are kind and strong and intelligent, and you make me want to be a better man. I know we have not known each other long, but I know my own heart. If you will have me, I want to stay in Oro Grande. I want to build a life here with you." Tears spilled down Winifred's cheeks, and she made no effort to wipe them away. "I love you too," she whispered. "I never thought I would say those words to anyone, but I love you, Quinton." He pulled her close, and she rested her head against his shoulder, feeling the steady beat of his heart through his shirt. They sat like that for a long time, wrapped in the warmth of each other and the certainty of what they had found. The following week, Quinton spoke to Mr. Dixon about buying a piece of land adjacent to Winifred's property. Dixon, a gruff but fair man, had been impressed by Quinton's work and was happy to sell. Quinton also made arrangements to continue working with the ranch's horses while building up his own place. "We will need a bigger house eventually," Quinton said as he and Winifred walked the boundary of his new land. "Something with room for a family." "A family?" Winifred asked, her voice soft. "If you want that. Children, I mean. I know we have not talked about marriage yet, but I intend to marry you, Winifred Sutton, if you will have me." "Is that a proposal?" Winifred asked, a smile playing at her lips. Quinton stopped walking and turned to face her. Then, to her surprise, he dropped to one knee right there in the dusty field. "I do not have a ring yet, but I will get you one, I promise. Winifred Sutton, you are the finest woman I have ever known. Will you marry me?" "Yes," Winifred said, pulling him to his feet. "Yes, I will marry you." They were married 6 weeks later in the same church where they had first danced. It was a small ceremony, attended by a handful of people. Mr. Dixon came, along with some of the ranch hands who had become friendly with Quinton. The preacher's wife played the piano. Winifred wore a simple white dress that she had sewn herself, with lace at the collar that Quinton had ordered special from San Francisco. Winifred had invited the whole town out of courtesy, but few came. Margaret Dover and her circle stayed away, as did most of the young women who had ignored Winifred for years. But Winifred found she did not care. The people who mattered were there. Mrs. Henderson, the elderly widow who had always been kind to her, sat in the front row and cried happy tears. Young Tommy from the general store came with his parents. And most importantly, Quinton was there, standing at the front of the church in his best clothes, his eyes shining with love as Winifred walked down the aisle toward him. When the preacher pronounced them husband and wife, Quinton kissed her sweetly, and Winifred felt complete in a way she never had before. They spent their wedding night in the small farmhouse, which now belonged to both of them. Quinton carried her over the threshold, making her laugh, and then set her down gently in the middle of the room. "Mrs. Xavier," he said, testing out the name. "I like the sound of that." "So do I," Winifred replied. He pulled her close and kissed her, deeper this time, and Winifred felt heat flood through her body. She had wondered about this night, had been nervous, but with Quinton's gentle hands and patient kisses, all her anxiety melted away. He was tender and careful, making sure she was comfortable every step of the way. When they finally came together, Winifred felt a sense of rightness, of two pieces fitting perfectly together. Afterward, they lay tangled in the sheets, Quinton's arm around her, her head on his chest. "Are you happy?" he asked softly. "Happier than I ever thought possible," Winifred answered honestly. The first months of marriage were a time of adjustment and joy. Winifred had lived alone for so long that having someone else in the house was strange at first. But Quinton was an easy person to live with. He was considerate and helpful, and he never made her feel like her contributions were less important than his. They worked together on both pieces of land, combining their resources and labor. The vegetables Winifred grew fed them through the winter, and the money Quinton earned from horse breaking paid for supplies and improvements. By the spring of 1883, they had saved enough money to begin building a larger house on Quinton's property. They hired a carpenter from town, but Quinton did much of the work himself, with Winifred helping where she could. It was hard labor, but satisfying. Winifred would bring water and food to the worksite, and sometimes she would simply sit and watch as the walls went up, imagining the life they would have in this house. One afternoon in late spring, as they were taking a break from work, Winifred realized she had not had her monthly courses in some time. She had been feeling tired and slightly queasy in the mornings, but had attributed it to the hard work. Now, as she counted back the weeks, she felt a flutter of excitement and fear. That evening, as they sat down to supper, she told Quinton. His face went through a series of expressions: surprise, joy, concern, before settling on pure happiness. He came around the table and pulled her into his arms. "A baby," he said wonderingly. "We are going to have a baby." "Are you happy?" Winifred asked, even though she could see the answer in his face. "Happy does not even begin to describe it. You have given me everything, Winifred, everything I ever wanted." The pregnancy was not easy. Winifred was sick most mornings for the first few months, and as she grew larger, the work on the farm became more difficult. But Quinton was attentive and protective, taking on more of the physical labor and insisting that she rest. The new house was completed by midsummer. A solid 2-story structure with a large kitchen, a parlor, 3 bedrooms upstairs, and a wide porch that wrapped around 2 sides. They moved in as soon as it was ready, and Winifred spent happy hours arranging their few pieces of furniture and planning how to decorate the nursery. Mrs. Henderson came to visit regularly, bringing baby clothes she had knitted and offering advice. She was the closest thing to a mother figure that Winifred had, and her kindness meant more than Winifred could express. As fall approached, and Winifred's belly grew round and heavy, Quinton became increasingly nervous. He hovered over her constantly, worried about her health and the health of the baby. Women have been having babies since the beginning of time, Winifred told him one evening, amused by his concern. I am strong. I will be fine. I know you are strong, Quinton said seriously. But you are also the most precious thing in my life. I could not bear it if something happened to you. Winifred took his hand and placed it on her belly where the baby was kicking vigorously. Feel that. This baby is as strong as both of us. Everything will be fine. In late October, Winifred's labor began. It started in the middle of the night, a dull ache in her back that gradually moved to her belly and intensified. She woke Quinton, and he immediately went to fetch Mrs. Henderson and the midwife, a capable woman named Mrs. Torres, who had delivered most of the babies in Oro Grande for the past 20 years. The labor was long and difficult. Winifred had never experienced pain like this, waves of it that seemed to consume her entire body. But Mrs. Torres was calm and encouraging, and Quinton stayed by her side the entire time, holding her hand and whispering words of love and support. As dawn broke, painting the sky pink and gold outside the bedroom window, Winifred gave one final push and heard the most beautiful sound she had ever heard, the strong, angry cry of her newborn baby. It is a boy, Mrs. Torres announced, holding up the squalling infant. A healthy baby boy. Quinton's eyes filled with tears as he looked at his son. The midwife cleaned the baby and wrapped him in a soft blanket, then placed him in Winifred's arms. The baby stopped crying almost immediately, his tiny eyes trying to focus on his mother's face. Winifred looked down at the perfect little person she had created, at his tiny fingers and the dark fuzz on his head, and felt love overwhelm her. She had thought she knew what love was when she married Quinton, but this was different, deeper, a primal connection that shook her to her core. He is perfect, Quinton whispered, touching one finger to the baby's tiny hand. The baby's fingers curled around Quinton's, gripping tight. Look at that. He is strong already. They named him James after Winifred's father, James Quinton Xavier. He was a good baby, healthy and strong, with his father's blue eyes and his mother's determined spirit. Those first months were exhausting, filled with sleepless nights and constant feedings, but also filled with moments of pure joy. Quinton was a devoted father, getting up with the baby at night, changing dirty diapers without complaint, and staring at his son with undisguised adoration. As James grew, the farm prospered. Quinton's reputation as a horse breaker grew, and people came from miles around to have him work with their animals. Winifred continued to tend her gardens, now with James strapped to her back in a carrier that Mrs. Henderson had made. The older woman came by frequently to dote on the baby and give Winifred breaks when she needed them. One afternoon, when James was about 6 months old, Winifred was in town buying supplies when she encountered Margaret Dover. The other woman was also there with her mother, selecting fabric for new dresses. Margaret looked at Winifred with the baby in her arms, and something complicated crossed her face. "Winifred," she said stiffly, "I heard you had a baby." "Yes, this is James," Winifred said, adjusting the blanket around her son. Margaret looked at the baby and then back at Winifred. "He is beautiful," she said, and for once there seemed to be genuine emotion in her voice. "You look happy." "I am," Winifred said simply. "I am getting married next month," Margaret said, as if compelled to share. "To Richard Thompson. You remember him?" "Yes, the lawyer's son. Congratulations." "Thank you." Margaret hesitated, then added, "I suppose I was wrong about your cowboy. He did settle down after all." "Yes, he did," Winifred said. She felt no need to say more. She had nothing to prove to Margaret or anyone else. Her happiness spoke for itself. As James grew into a toddler, he showed signs of inheriting both his parents' best qualities. He was curious and intelligent like his mother, but also fearless and charming like his father. He followed Quinton around the farm, trying to help with chores, and he loved the horses with a passion that made Quinton laugh. In the spring of 1885, when James was 18 months old, Winifred discovered she was pregnant again. This pregnancy was easier than the first, perhaps because she knew what to expect. Their daughter was born in December, just before Christmas. They named her Ruth after Quinton's grandmother. She was a tiny, delicate baby with dark hair and hazel eyes like her mother. James was fascinated by his baby sister, wanting to touch her constantly and bringing her his favorite toys. The years passed in a rhythm of work and family, hardship and joy. There were difficult times, of course. A drought in 1886 nearly destroyed the crops, and they had to carefully ration water and watch anxiously as the plants struggled. But they made it through together, Quinton taking extra work where he could find it, and Winifred being creative with the resources they had. In 1887, they welcomed another son, whom they named Daniel. He was born in the heat of summer and was the easiest of all the births. He was a calm, happy baby who seemed content just to observe the world around him. By the time Daniel was born, the farm and horse-breaking business had become quite successful. They had expanded the land, hired a hand to help with the heavy work, and built a larger barn. Quinton had earned a reputation as one of the best horsemen in the county, and people sought him out specifically. Winifred had also become known for her produce, which was always fresh and high quality. She had expanded her garden and now sold regularly at the market, often selling out of everything she brought. She had even begun preserving fruits and vegetables to sell in the winter months, a business that brought in steady income. But more than their material success, what mattered most to both of them was their family. Every evening, no matter how hard the day had been, they would gather together for supper. Quinton would tell stories about the horses he had worked with that day. James would share his adventures exploring the property, and Ruth would chatter about the flowers she had picked or the pictures she had drawn. Daniel, still too young for much conversation, would bang his spoon on the table and laugh at his siblings. After the children were in bed, Quinton and Winifred would sit on the porch together, just as they had in the early days of their courtship. They would talk about their plans, their dreams, the little details of their day, and sometimes they would just sit in comfortable silence, holding hands and watching the stars. "You ever think about that night at the dance?" Winifred asked one evening. "About how different everything could have been?" "I think about it often," Quinton said. "I think about how close I came to missing you. If I had arrived in town a day later, if I had been too tired to attend the dance, if I had asked someone else first. There are so many ways I might never have found you." "Why did you ask me?" Winifred said. "I have always wondered. There were so many prettier girls there, girls who were waiting to be asked." Quinton turned to look at her, his eyes serious in the lamplight. "Do you want the truth? I saw you standing there alone, and I saw the way you were watching everyone else with such longing but also such resignation. Like you had given up on being included but still could not help hoping. And I thought, there is a woman who understands what it is like to be on the outside." I had been traveling for 2 years, never staying anywhere long enough to be part of a community, always being the outsider. When I saw you, I saw someone who might understand that loneliness, and I wanted to know you. Winifred felt tears prick her eyes. "I am so grateful you saw me." "I will always see you," Quinton said, pulling her close. "For the rest of my life, you will be the only woman I see." In 1888, their 4th child was born, another daughter whom they named Catherine. She was a fiery, spirited baby from the moment she entered the world, with a powerful set of lungs and strong opinions about everything. James was 7 now, Ruth was 3, and Daniel was almost 2. The house was full of noise and life and chaos, and Winifred had never been happier. Mrs. Henderson, now quite elderly, still came to visit when her health allowed. She would sit in the rocking chair in the parlor, whichever baby was youngest on her lap, and tell stories about the old days. The children adored her, calling her Grandma Henderson, and she treated them as if they were her own grandchildren. As the children grew, they each developed distinct personalities. James was responsible and steady, taking his role as oldest child seriously. He loved working with his father and the horses, and by the time he was 10, he was already quite skilled at handling even difficult animals. Ruth was creative and gentle, always drawing pictures or making up stories to tell her younger siblings. Daniel was quiet and thoughtful, content to spend hours reading the books that Winifred had saved from her childhood or observing the natural world around the farm. And Catherine, true to her first impression, was bold and determined, never backing down from a challenge and keeping everyone on their toes. The town's attitude toward Winifred had shifted over the years. She was no longer the invisible woman at the edge of the room. She was Mrs. Xavier, respected businesswoman and mother of 4. People greeted her warmly at church and in the market. Some of the women who had ignored her in the past now sought her advice about gardening or preserving food. A few had even apologized in roundabout ways for how they had treated her before. Winifred was cordial to everyone, but kept her closest friendship with Mrs. Henderson. She had learned long ago who her real friends were, and she saw no reason to pretend that the past had not happened. But she bore no bitterness about it either. Her life was too full and too good to waste energy on old hurts. In 1892, when James was 11 and Catherine was 4, Mrs. Henderson passed away peacefully in her sleep. The whole family mourned her loss. She had been the closest thing to a grandmother the children had known, and her kindness and wisdom would be deeply missed. At the funeral, Winifred spoke about how much Mrs. Henderson had meant to her, how her compassion had been a light during dark times. Many people in the church cried, moved by Winifred's words. Life continued on as it always does. The children grew and learned and changed. James, at 16, was nearly as tall as his father and increasingly capable of handling the farm work on his own. Ruth, at 12, had shown a talent for sewing and design, creating beautiful clothes for herself and her younger sister. Daniel, at 11, had developed a love of writing and was always scribbling in the notebooks that his parents gave him. And Catherine, at 8, was learning everything she could about the business side of the farm, fascinated by numbers and accounts. In 1896, Winifred was surprised to discover that she was pregnant again at the age of 36. She had assumed her childbearing years were over, but apparently nature had other plans. This pregnancy was harder than the others, her body older and more tired. But she had Quinton's constant support and the help of her older children, who took on extra responsibilities without complaint. Their 5th child, a son they named Robert, was born in early 1897. He was a sweet, easygoing baby who seemed to fit perfectly into the family. James was 17 now, Ruth was 13, Daniel was 12, and Catherine was 9. They all doted on the new baby, taking turns holding him and helping care for him. Quinton, at 41, was still strong and vital, though his dark hair now had threads of silver at the temples. He still worked with horses every day, though he had trained James to take over more of the work. The farm and business were more successful than ever, providing a comfortable life for the family. One evening, as they celebrated Robert's first birthday surrounded by all their children, Winifred looked around the table and felt overwhelmed with gratitude. She thought back to that young woman who had stood alone at the church dance, convinced she would always be invisible, always be alone. That woman could never have imagined this life, this abundance of love and family. After the children were in bed, Quinton found Winifred standing on the porch, looking out at the land they had built together. "What are you thinking about?" he asked, wrapping his arms around her from behind. "About how lucky I am," Winifred said, leaning back against him. "About how one moment, one decision changed everything. If you had not asked me to dance that night." "But I did," Quinton said, kissing her temple. "And I would do it again 1,000 times over. You are the best decision I ever made, Winifred Xavier." The years continued to pass, bringing both joy and challenges. In 1899, James, now 20, married a sweet young woman named Elizabeth from a neighboring ranch. The wedding was a large affair, celebrated by the whole community. Winifred cried happy tears as she watched her firstborn son pledge his life to another person, remembering her own wedding day and the love that had started it all. Ruth, at 16, was beginning to court a young man who worked at the general store. He was polite and hardworking, and Quinton had given his careful approval. Daniel, at 15, was showing no interest in romance yet, more focused on his studies and his writing. Catherine, at 12, declared loudly and often that she would never get married because it seemed like too much trouble, which made everyone laugh. Robert, the baby of the family at 3 years old, was a cheerful, active child who kept everyone entertained with his antics. In the spring of 1901, James and Elizabeth welcomed their first child, a daughter named Emma. Winifred held her granddaughter and felt her heart expand yet again. She was a grandmother now, a role she had not even allowed herself to dream about in those lonely years before Quinton. Quinton was equally smitten with his granddaughter, and Winifred often caught him making silly faces at the baby or rocking her to sleep in the afternoon sun. "We have built something beautiful," Quinton said one day, as they watched James play with Emma in the yard. "Not just the farm and the business, but this family, this legacy of love. It started with you," Winifred said. "With your kindness that night, you saw me when no one else did." "And you gave me a home when I was lost," Quinton replied. "We saved each other, I think." Ruth married in 1902, a beautiful ceremony that again brought the community together. Her husband, Thomas, took over running the general store from his aging father, and Ruth used her sewing skills to open a small dressmaking business. She had inherited her mother's work ethic and eye for quality, and her business quickly became successful. Daniel, at 18, announced that he wanted to attend college in San Francisco to study journalism. It was difficult for Winifred to think of her quiet son so far away, but she and Quinton had always encouraged their children to pursue their dreams. They helped him with the costs and sent him off with their blessing and their love. Catherine, at 15, had not changed her mind about marriage. She was running much of the business side of the farm now, having a natural head for numbers and negotiation. She was also one of the best riders in the county, able to handle horses almost as well as her father and older brother. Robert, at 6, was starting school and showing signs of inheriting the family's various talents. He loved the horses like his father, had his mother's patience with growing things, and was already reading better than most children twice his age. As the new century progressed, life in Oro Grande changed. The railroad had come through, bringing more people and more commerce. The town was growing, modernizing. Electricity had reached the main street, though the farm still relied on lamps. There were even automobiles now, though horses were still more practical for ranch work. But through all the changes, the Xavier family remained constant. Quinton and Winifred had been married for nearly 20 years now, and their love had only deepened with time. They had weathered droughts and financial hardships, illness and loss, the challenges of raising 5 children. Through it all, they had stood together, their partnership unshakable. In 1904, James and Elizabeth welcomed their second child, a son named Quinton after his grandfather. The name touched Quinton deeply, and he held his namesake with tears in his eyes. "I never imagined this," he told Winifred that night. "A grandson bearing my name. It makes me feel like the life we have built will go on, will continue after we are gone." "Of course it will," Winifred said. "We have created something strong. Our children know what real love looks like, what a true partnership means. They will pass that on to their children and their children's children." Ruth also announced that she was expecting, due to give birth in the late summer. Daniel wrote long letters from San Francisco, describing his studies and his work with a newspaper. He seemed happy and fulfilled, though he missed the family. Catherine, at 18, had taken over most of the farm management, allowing Quinton to focus more on the horse work he loved. And Robert, at 9, was growing like a weed, already nearly as tall as Catherine and showing promise as both a student and a horseman. One evening in late summer of 1904, the entire family gathered for Sunday supper, a tradition they maintained as much as possible. James was there with Elizabeth and their 2 children. Ruth came with Thomas, her belly round with her first child. Daniel was home visiting from San Francisco. Catherine and Robert still lived at home, of course. The house was full of noise and laughter, multiple conversations happening at once, babies crying and children playing. Winifred stood in the kitchen, preparing food with the help of her daughters and daughters-in-law, and felt a profound sense of peace. This was what she had longed for all those years ago, standing alone at the edge of the dance floor. Not just a husband, though Quinton was more than she ever could have hoped for. But this a family, a sense of belonging, a place where she was not just seen but essential. After supper, as the dishes were being washed and put away, Quinton pulled Winifred outside onto the porch. The sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. They could hear the sounds of their family inside, the children laughing, their adult children talking and teasing each other. "You remember what I told you on our wedding night?" Quinton asked, holding Winifred close. "That you had made me happier than I thought possible." "I remember," Winifred said. "Well, I was wrong. I did not know then how happy it was possible to be. Every year with you has been better than the last. Every child, every grandchild, every moment we have built together. You have given me a life beyond my wildest dreams." Winifred turned to look up at him, at the face she loved so much, now lined with age and experience but still so dear to her. "You gave me the same. You saw me, Quinton, when no one else did. You saw me, and then you never stopped looking." "I never will," Quinton promised, and kissed her as the sun set behind them. Ruth's baby, a healthy boy named Michael, was born in September. Daniel came home for the birth and stayed for 2 weeks, clearly torn between his life in San Francisco and his family in Oro Grande. Catherine continued to run the farm with impressive efficiency, and had started making suggestions about expanding into cattle raising in addition to crops and horses. Robert, at 10, was his father's constant shadow, learning everything he could about working with horses. In 1906, when Catherine was 20, she surprised everyone by announcing that she was going to marry. The young man was a banker's son from the next county over, someone she had met through her business dealings. His name was Peter, and he had been courting her quietly for months before anyone in the family noticed. Unlike Catherine's previous declarations about never marrying, she seemed genuinely happy with Peter, and he clearly respected her intelligence and business acumen. "I thought you said marriage was too much trouble," Winifred teased when Catherine told her the news. "I thought it was," Catherine admitted. "But then I met someone who does not expect me to stop being myself. Peter wants a partner, not a decoration. That makes all the difference." The wedding was held in the spring of 1907, and it was as practical and efficient as Catherine herself, but also beautiful in its simplicity. Peter moved to the farm after the wedding, working alongside Catherine to manage and expand the business. He had a background in finance that complemented Catherine's operational skills perfectly. Meanwhile, Daniel had met a woman in San Francisco, a fellow writer named Sarah. He brought her home to meet the family in the summer of 1907, and it was clear to everyone that he was deeply in love. Sarah was intelligent and kind, with a quick wit that kept everyone laughing. She and Daniel were married in a small ceremony in San Francisco later that year, though they promised to visit Oro Grande regularly. By 1908, Winifred and Quinton had 5 grandchildren, with more on the way. James and Elizabeth were expecting their 3rd child. Ruth and Thomas had 2 boys now. Catherine and Peter were talking about starting a family soon. The farm had expanded significantly, now including a substantial cattle operation that was proving quite profitable. The family business was thriving, providing employment not just for family members but for several hired hands as well. Robert, at 13, was already as tall as his father and showing signs of inheriting Quinton's natural ability with horses. He had a special gift for gentling even the most difficult animals, using patience and understanding rather than force. One day, Quinton took Robert aside and gave him a horse he had been working with, a beautiful chestnut gelding with a white star on his forehead. "This is yours," Quinton told his youngest son. "You have earned it. You are almost as good with horses as I am now." Robert's face lit up with joy and pride. "Thank you, Pa, I learned from the best." Watching them together, Winifred felt her eyes mist with tears. Quinton had been such a wonderful father, patient and loving with each of their children, teaching them not just skills but values. He had shown their sons how to treat women with respect and their daughters how to expect and demand that respect. He had taught all of them about hard work, integrity, and the importance of family. As the years passed, the children and grandchildren continued to grow and thrive. In 1910, Winifred and Quinton celebrated their 28th wedding anniversary. They were both in their 50s now, their hair gray, their bodies showing the wear of decades of hard work. But they were healthy and active, still deeply involved in the farm and the family. The anniversary celebration was held at the farm, with all their children and grandchildren present. There were now 8 grandchildren, ranging in age from 13-year-old Emma to baby Joseph, who was just 6 months old. The house and yard were filled with family, 3 generations of Xaviers together. As Winifred looked around at the gathering, she thought about how far she had come from that invisible young woman at the dance. She had created this not alone, but with Quinton by her side. This loving, boisterous, successful family was their legacy. During the celebration, James stood up to make a toast. "To my parents," he said, raising his glass. "You taught us what love really means. Not just romantic love, though anyone can see how devoted you are to each other even after all these years. But also the love that shows up every day, that works hard, that sacrifices, that never gives up. Ma, Pa, you built something beautiful, and we are all grateful to be part of it." Everyone raised their glasses, echoing the sentiment. Winifred and Quinton looked at each other, both with tears in their eyes. Later, when the party had wound down and most people had left, Quinton and Winifred walked together to the spot where they had first stood looking at his newly purchased land all those years ago. So much had changed since then. Where there had been empty fields, there were now buildings and corrals, crops and cattle. Where there had been just the two of them, there was now a whole family. "I love you," Quinton said, the same words he had spoken countless times over the years, but they never got old. "Today, tomorrow, and always." "And I love you," Winifred replied. "Thank you for seeing me, for asking me to dance, for never leaving." "I could never leave you," Quinton said. "You are my home, Winifred. You always have been." They stood there in the fading light, two people who had found each other against the odds and built a life beyond imagining. The sounds of their family drifted from the house, laughter and conversation, the sounds of grandchildren playing. It was the music of a full, rich life, a symphony they had composed together one day at a time. As the stars began to appear in the darkening sky, Quinton took Winifred's hand and, right there in the middle of their land, began to dance with her, humming the tune that had played at that first dance so many years ago. Winifred laughed and followed his lead, just as she had that night. They danced slowly in the twilight, an older couple now, but with hearts as young and full of love as they had been on that distant evening, when a lonely woman and a wandering cowboy had found each other in a crowded room. In the years that followed, the Xavier family continued to grow and flourish. By 1915, Winifred and Quinton had 13 grandchildren, and their first great-grandchild was on the way, as Emma, their oldest grandchild, had recently married. The farm had become one of the most successful operations in the region, known for quality horses, cattle, and produce. Robert, now 20, had taken over most of the day-to-day horse operations, allowing Quinton to finally slow down a bit. Though he was nearing 60, Quinton still spent time with the horses every day. It was in his blood, and Winifred knew he would never fully retire. Ruth had 4 children now and was helping Thomas run an expanded version of the general store. Daniel and Sarah had settled permanently in San Francisco, where Daniel had become a respected journalist, and Sarah had published 2 novels. They visited regularly and always spoke of Oro Grande with fondness. Catherine and Peter had 3 children and had expanded the cattle operation significantly, making it the most profitable part of the family business. The years had been kind to Winifred and Quinton. They had their health, their family, and each other. They still sat on the porch together every evening, still held hands, still talked about everything and nothing. The passion of youth had mellowed into a deep, abiding companionship that was perhaps even more precious than those first heady days of romance. In the spring of 1918, they celebrated their 36th wedding anniversary. The whole family gathered again, now including 14 grandchildren and 2 great-grandchildren. It was a joyous occasion, though tinged with worry about the war raging in Europe. Several young men from the county had already enlisted, and there was talk that the conflict might continue for some time. But on this day, surrounded by family, those concerns were set aside. The celebration was held outside, under a warm California sun. Tables were set up in the yard, groaning with food. Children ran around playing tag and hide and seek. The adults talked and laughed, sharing stories and catching up. At one point, young Emma, now 24 and a mother herself, approached Winifred. "Grandma, will you tell me about how you and Grandpa met? I have heard pieces of the story, but I want to hear the whole thing." Soon, several of the grandchildren and great-grandchildren had gathered around, all wanting to hear the story. Winifred looked over at Quinton, who came to sit beside her, and together they told the tale. They spoke of the dance, of how Quinton had asked Winifred when no one else would, of how he had never left. They talked about the early days of their marriage, the struggles and the triumphs, the building of the farm and the family. The children listened with rapt attention, and when the story was finished, Emma said, "That is the most romantic thing I have ever heard." "Grandpa saw you when no one else did." "He did," Winifred said, reaching for Quinton's hand. "And he kept seeing me, every single day since then." "And I always will," Quinton said, bringing her hand to his lips and kissing it gently. As the sun began to set on that perfect day, Winifred looked around at the family they had created and felt complete contentment. She had been invisible once, ignored and overlooked. But one man had seen her, had chosen her, had loved her. And from that one moment of being seen, she had built a life of such richness and joy that her younger self would never have believed it possible. The children were putting on an impromptu play now, something they had devised themselves about cowboys and ranching. Robert's oldest daughter, 7-year-old Lucy, was playing a cowboy, complete with one of her grandfather's old hats. She was chasing her cousins around the yard, lassoing them with a rope and declaring them captured cattle. Quinton laughed at the sight. "She has your spirit," he told Winifred. "And your love of horses," Winifred replied. They watched the children play as the light faded and the stars came out. Eventually, the families began packing up to head home, hugging and promising to visit soon. James and his family stayed to help clean up, as did Catherine and Peter. When everyone had finally left and the house was quiet again, Quinton and Winifred stood in their bedroom getting ready for bed. Winifred caught sight of herself in the mirror, gray hair, lined face, the marks of age and time evident. But when she looked over at Quinton, she saw him looking at her with the same love and admiration he had shown that first night at the dance. "What are you thinking?" she asked. "That you are still the most beautiful woman I have ever seen," Quinton said simply. "That I am the luckiest man alive. That I would do it all again, exactly the same way." "Even the hard parts?" Winifred asked. "Especially the hard parts," Quinton said, "because they made us stronger. They made us who we are." They climbed into bed and Winifred curled against Quinton's side, his arm around her, exactly as they had done for 36 years. This was home, she thought. Not the house or the land, though those were precious. But this being held by the man who had seen her, who had chosen her, who had never left. "I love you, Quinton Xavier," she whispered into the darkness. "And I love you, Winifred Xavier," he replied. "From that first dance to this moment and beyond, forever." The years continued to pass peacefully. The farm remained successful, managed now primarily by the second generation, with the third generation beginning to take on more responsibility. Quinton finally did retire from active horse breaking when he was 65, though he still spent time in the barns and corrals, offering advice and enjoying the company of the animals he had worked with his entire life. Winifred, at 62, had also stepped back from the heavy farm work, though she still maintained a small garden where she grew flowers and vegetables for the family. She spent more time with the grandchildren and great-grandchildren, passing on her skills and her stories. In 1923, they celebrated their 41st wedding anniversary with a quiet dinner, just the two of them. The family had offered to throw a big party, but Winifred and Quinton had requested something simple. They sat on their porch as they had done thousands of times before, watching the sunset paint the sky in brilliant colors. 41 years, Quinton mused. It has gone so fast. And yet each day has been full, Winifred said. We have lived well, you and I. We have indeed. Do you have any regrets, my love? Winifred considered the question seriously. No, she said finally. Not a single one. Every choice led me here to you, to this life, even the painful years before we met, because they taught me to appreciate what we have. I have one regret, Quinton said, and Winifred looked at him in surprise. "I regret that I did not find you sooner, that you had to spend so many years feeling invisible and alone. But if you had found me sooner, we might not have been ready for each other," Winifred pointed out. "You needed to have your adventures to see the world, and I needed to learn to stand on my own to be strong. We found each other at exactly the right time." "You are right, as always," Quinton said, pulling her close. "You are very wise, Mrs. Xavier." "I have had a good teacher," Winifred replied, resting her head on his shoulder. They sat in comfortable silence, watching the day fade into night. Inside the house, they could hear the clock ticking, marking the passage of time. But out here, with Quinton's arm around her and the familiar land stretching out before them, Winifred felt timeless. This moment was eternal, one of thousands they had shared, each one precious. As the stars began to appear, Quinton stood and offered Winifred his hand. "May I have this dance?" Winifred laughed but took his hand, and they danced slowly on the porch. No music but the wind in the trees and the distant sound of cattle lowing. They moved together as they always had, in perfect harmony, two people who had become one through decades of love and partnership. When the dance ended, they went inside, arm in arm, ready to face whatever years remained together. And in the morning, they would wake up side by side as they had done for 41 years, grateful for another day together, another chance to love and be loved. Their story, which had begun with a simple dance invitation at a church gathering in 1882, had blossomed into a legacy of love that would endure for generations. The cowboy who had asked the invisible woman to dance had indeed never left, and together they had built something beautiful and lasting. This was their happily ever after, not a fairy tale ending but something better, a real, lived happiness earned through choice and commitment, through seeing and being seen, through loving and being loved. And it would continue in their children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren, all of whom carried forward the lesson that Quinton and Winifred had taught them. That true love begins with truly seeing another person, and that once you find it, you hold on tight and never let go.